Thanks so much for being here. It's virtual, but we really appreciate y'all's time and really being here with us, joining us. And we would like to introduce our amazing speaker, Dr. Zalta, for their workshop, What I Say, How to Support Loved Ones After Trauma.
Great. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for taking time out of your weekend to be here today. I'm excited to see all of you that have joined, and I'm excited to see a lot of names that I recognize. So wonderful to see all of you, whether you're from class or lab or various other places. Today, I'm going to be just sharing with you my thoughts on how we talk with folks and support people who've experienced trauma. This is something that I get a lot of emails from students who take my class and say, hey, I have somebody that I really care about who's going through a hard time. What do I do? What do I say? How do I give them what they need? And so this workshop really kind of stemmed from that, as well as some of my work looking into social support as a predictor of who does well after trauma. I love having interactive talks, so please feel free to put things in the chat as I go. I'm happy for you to stop me. Don't feel like you have to save your questions. So please feel free to put things in the chat. Okay, with that, I will go ahead and share my screen. I have some slides to guide us, but as I said, I'm more than happy to kind of go off script and just answer your questions. I'm going to try to save about 10 minutes at the end. And I'm going to pop up the chat. Well, that's going to block too much of my screen. Okay, I'll see it pop up if I need to. What do I say, right? How to support loved ones after trauma. So I think the first thing we need to talk about is what is trauma, right? What are we even talking about here? So according to the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, a trauma is an event that involves actual or threatened death, actual or threatened serious injury, or actual or threatened sexual violation. So these are really intense events, right, that come with a real serious risk of harm to the individual. These can be directly experienced, they can be witnessed, you can learn about it happening to a close family member or friend, so you can experience one of these events in many different ways. And I've listed out a number of examples here, so things like assault, combat, accidents, so major car accidents, other types of accidents, natural disasters, mass violence, and life-threatening illnesses as well. And one of the important things to realize about trauma is that many people experience trauma in their lifetime. So if you look at this kind of infographic that I put, right, about 50% of women and about 60% of men experience trauma in their lifetime. That's a lot. That means 1 out of every 2 people you meet, right? But you can see here 7 to 8 out of every 100 Americans, so that's 7 to 8% of people, will experience PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder during their lifetime. So that means, while a lot of people may experience trauma, only a small portion of those go on to experience PTSD. So what determines who goes on to develop PTSD? And one of the things that I've been really interested in is the fact that social support is one of the biggest predictors of who develops PTSD after trauma. We measure all kinds of things, right? Whether you have other mental health disorders, whether you dissociated during the trauma, a million variables. And social support continues to be one of the strongest predictors of who develops PTSD after trauma, which I find to be totally amazing. And that means that you all, right, can be a force for good. That's a great thing because it's something that we can manipulate. It's something that we can change. Now, social support, when I talk about social support, it comes in a lot of different shapes and sizes, right? It's not just one thing. So when we think about social support in the context of trauma, we can think about responses to disclosure. So that means when somebody shares with you their experience, right, discloses to you that they've experienced a traumatic event, how do you respond in that moment, right? So it's kind of an intimate one-on-one kind of interaction. And I'll say that we think of trauma disclosures as being very planned, but oftentimes they come out very unplanned, where perhaps somebody feels like they've disappointed a person or let someone down, and they feel like they need to explain why they're behaving in the way that they're behaving. And so they end up disclosing trauma to kind of explain other behavior without really the intention to sit down and say, I wanted to tell you about this thing, right? So trauma disclosures can come out at times that maybe you don't expect. There's also kind of general emotional support that you receive from your network, right? So, and I know we've all felt this feeling of what is our network? How do you connect to people over the course of the past year and a half, right? And feeling connected to people, linked to people. How many people do you feel linked to? What do you need to do to feel connected to people? And kind of when you're struggling, what helps you to feel kind of emotionally supported by people, right? So that general sense that you have when you walk around the world that I have people who care about me, I have people who will listen to me, right? That sort of thing. And then there's also things like instrumental support. So will someone watch my kids if I need help, right? Will somebody, provide financial assistance if I need help, right? So there are many different types of social support. So what I've been doing is I've been really interested to better understand what types of social support help to protect people when they experience trauma. And we've learned a couple of things. The first thing that we've learned that's really important is that negative social reactions are way more harmful than positive social support is protective. So that means that when we see people exhibiting criticism, blame, hostility, right? And I'll go through in detail kind of what the don'ts are, right? That those things are really potent and they really do affect how people respond to trauma. Now, we also know that general positive emotional support is protective, right? So it is also still important. So I don't want to suggest that that's not important. They're both really important. But I think that we hear social support and we think about all the good stuff, and we forget that there's also a bunch of stuff that might interfere and get in the way and actually make things worse, right? So that's one really important lesson that we've learned, is that we have to be really careful about trying to decrease kind of negative social reactions to trauma and increase positive reactions, supportive interactions. And the other thing I want to say about that before I get started is I have a full belief that most negative interactions are completely unintentional, right? These aren't people who are meaning to go out and harm people or are jerks, right? That's not what's happening. I think that it's really, really, truly unintentional, and people are well-meaning, but might make certain missteps when trying to support other folks. So what I'm hoping to do today is kind of walk through. I'm going to start with the don'ts because we know they're the most important. So the data says that we should start there. So that's why I'm going to start with those. And then I'm going to go over to the do's. I just noticed for the Reclaim team, I can't see my timer or anything. So just send me, if I can see your faces though. So if I start to go long, just give me a wave or something like that. Because I want to make sure I save time for questions. Okay, so with that, why is it so hard to know what to say to people who share hard things? And I'll say I'm talking about trauma, but I'm also just talking about when people share hard stuff in their lives with you, right? These same principles apply. So why is it so hard? Feel free to put some ideas in the chat. I have some thoughts, but oh, and now my chat bar has disappeared. Let me see if I can get that back. Or maybe my Reclaim team, if anybody puts something in the chat, you can shout out to me what they're saying. Oh, there we go. Now I have it back. Any thoughts? Have you ever had concern for overstepping? Yep. Not knowing it's safe to share. Great. Worry about saying the wrong thing. That's right. Yeah, right. So often what comes up is our own fears come up, right? We get very strong emotions when people share really hard stuff with us. Right, you're unsure if you may unintentionally harm them, right? You want to be a good helper, but you're scared, right? Like you're scared about what it might mean for you to be the person who feels responsible for this person's well-being in this moment, right? And it brings up a lot of emotions for us. The other thing I feel like at least comes up for me is that I haven't necessarily had the experience they've had, right? So that's kind of hard because I don't know exactly what that thing is like, because these are extreme events, right? So it's quite likely that you haven't had that same experience. And then I think the other thing that comes up, so there's that emotional response, there's the fact that you may not have had that same shared experience. And then there's also the fact that I feel like you really want to say kind of the right thing, as we've talked about, but at the same time, we want to protect ourselves. When we hear something scary, we want to be very much protective of our own feelings. And those two things can really conflict. Yeah, you're unsure if you're qualified or experienced to talk about these things. That's right. So what does it mean if I'm the helper, right? I'm suddenly in a position that I don't necessarily feel prepared to be in, right? So that can be kind of scary. So I feel like all of these things really contribute to not really knowing what to say in that moment, right? And so again, I don't think it's that it's kind of intentional. I think it really comes from a place of feeling uneasy in that moment and wanting to know, what do I do? So I'm really glad you're all here to learn something so that you can all be prepared to be good supporters of your loved ones. Okay, so first thing, the don'ts, right? So I'm going to go through for a few of those. So the first thing that we don't want to do, blame and criticize, right? It seems very, very obvious, but what does this typically look like? Typically, this is when people ask things like why or how. Why were you there? How did that happen? Right? Most of this comes from a place of shock sometimes, where you are really trying to like learn the information, but in trying to learn about what happened rather than trying to support the person, the implication is, what did you do wrong? Right? So I think the other thing that people try to do is they try to learn what happened as a way to think, well, I wouldn't end up in that situation, right? And again, that's not conscious. That's not an intentional thing. But it's to say, like, what are the circumstances that led this really scary thing to happen to you that would allow me to make sure I don't end up in those scary circumstances? But as a result, it comes across as blame and criticism, right? So we really want to make sure that we're not questioning either the behaviors that led up to the event or reactions during and after the event. Why didn't you run? Right? Why did you stay? Why, right? So the why questions are really things like to just say like, I got to stay away from the whys as much as I possibly can. Another way that I like to put this is you shouldn't should all over the person, right? You should have gone to the hospital, right? So we can say should with a lot of really good intentions, but should means that they didn't do something and you're telling them that they've done something wrong. So really the whys and the shoulds are things that we should avoid. Any questions about that or thoughts about how people respond in that way? Okay, so that may seem like an obvious one. The next one that I think is really important is this term called social constraint. It may not be something that you've really thought much about before, but the idea is that there are ways in which we can respond to people that makes them refrain from disclosure or modify their disclosure in a way that essentially the message you're sending is, I don't want to hear it, right? Like it's too much for me. I don't want to hear what you're saying. And again, these can be really well-intentioned things like, oh, don't worry about it so much, right? So the idea is that you're trying to comfort the person, oh, I'm sure it'll be fine. It's not that, oh, well, it could have gone worse, right? It's not that big of a deal. Why don't you just try to put it out of your mind? But essentially what you're doing by doing that, and you, again, I'm not saying you personally, but the broad you, right? Is either trying to avoid the topic or minimize the impact on the individual, right? And so the trick is that what that teaches the person is, oh, I'm not in a safe space to talk about this thing. I shouldn't somehow be feeling the way I'm feeling. You're telling me to feel differently because I'm telling you that I'm upset and you're saying it's going to be fine, right? So essentially, these are ways of just trying of constraining the individual again in how they talk about the trauma, how they are feeling in reaction to the trauma. And really what we want to do is let people know that however they're responding is exactly the way they should be, right? So this is kind of our second don't. Okay, the third one is make it about yourself. Again, this is one of those things that can come up very unintentionally, because what can happen is that you can feel a lot of anger, rage, right? Somebody that you care about has been hurt. That can make you really mad and really angry, or it can make you really sad, right? And the problem that can happen is if there's all that emotion in you and that comes out a lot, is that the survivor suddenly feels like they have to comfort and protect the supporter, right? So they're suddenly in the job of comforting the supporter by either dialing back, oh, it wasn't so bad, I'm really doing okay, right? Sort of thing. And so I feel like that is one of the things, I'm going to go kill him. You can hear it and like see it in movies, right? That line that comes up, and it's not supportive of the survivor in that moment. Now it's really tricky because we of course are allowed to have natural emotions in response to what people share with us. And you should, right? If you had no emotions, how could you be an empathic listener, right? If somebody told you something totally devastating and you were like, oh, okay. Right? That would also not be a very good response. So how do we have our emotions, but not make it about our emotions, right? It's a really fine line. It's a really fine line between being a genuine person and somehow making it about you and your emotional reactions, right? I think one emotional reaction that people often have that can lead things astray here too is shock. You just think like, I had no idea that thing happened to you. And suddenly it's about my knowledge and me rather than about what's going on with you, right? Because I feel so shocked. I've been your best friend for 10 years and you never told me blank, right? But now suddenly it's about me and my needs as a friend, right? Rather than about the person. So again, very well intentioned, but not necessarily most supportive. The other thing that's really tricky is my second bullet point, because it can go well and it can go really poorly, is when you try to share something that you've experienced and attempt to relate to the person, right? So if they say, oh my gosh, this terrible, terrible thing happened to me, and you say, oh, I know exactly what that's like. I've had this terrible thing happen to me, right? On the one hand, having shared experiences can feel very normalizing for a person, right? But on the other hand, there's a real risk that either A, you suddenly make it about your thing when it's really should be about their thing, and B, there's then some sort of comparison between your thing and their thing, which isn't really a great idea, right? Because we're not trying to one up each other on our traumas, right? And also, I think that when we try to do that, we can also sometimes miss the mark where they say, I've had this thing happen to me. And you're like, oh, I totally get it. I've had blank happen to me. And they're thinking, that's not really the same thing, and when you do that, right, you lose that connection and that rapport. So I think it can be okay to share one's experience, but it has to be done really delicately. And you have to really think, am I doing this for me or am I doing this for them? Right. So if the person said, am I alone here? Like, am I the only person who's ever had this happen? Am I the only one who feels this way? That might be a good time to share, right? And say, you're not alone. I don't know exactly what it was like for you, but I've also seen blank, right? But if that's not coming up, you have to be really, really careful about walking the line where you suddenly make the sharing about your sharing, right? So a tricky one. Questions about these, because I know these are not black and white, right? There's not, and I think this is the other reason why it's so hard to know what to say, is also because everyone's different. Every circumstance is different. Your relationship with that person is going to be different, right? Depending on who it is. And that makes all of these little decisions really, really hard. Okay, I keep eyeballing the chat just in case, but feel free to start throwing things in there. Okay, the other don't. So the next don't number 4, don't treat someone differently. again, this seems obvious, but sometimes we just get really overwhelmed when we're the supporter, right? And so sometimes people feel the need to pull away just to protect themselves, right? Sometimes when people disclose to you, and maybe it's the first disclosure they've done, they feel really, really connected to you, but that might feel like a lot, right? And then on the flip side, once you learn something about a person, it can be, you can want to protect them, but ultimately start treating the person as very fragile, right? Like, oh, I can't invite them to do that something because maybe it'll upset them. Oh, maybe I can't, right, reach out because what if I say the wrong thing? And so what can happen is that you start to treat the person differently out of concern for them. But the problem is that people are usually terrified of disclosure because of this idea that once somebody knows blank about me, they'll never see me the same way again, right? They'll think I'm broken, they'll think I'm damaged, they'll think I'm unlovable, right? They'll think X about me. And so while your change in behavior is out of desire to protect, that doesn't mean that's how that behavior is going to be interpreted, right? It's way more likely to be interpreted as, oh, this person now no longer sees me in the same way. They think I'm, right, blank. And so, and at the same time, if you've learned something new about a person, right, they've shared something really important about themselves and about an experience, and you think, wow, okay, so they've just shared with me that they had a really bad incident happen in a bar. I don't know how I feel about inviting them to bars. I mean, maybe they'll be uncomfortable going to bars, right? Like you're really trying to be sensitive to not just ignore everything you just learned from this person, right? So there's a real balance between trying to be respectful of someone based on your new knowledge versus trying to treat them exactly the same before that conversation, right? And I think usually the best way to handle this is to be really open and say like, hey, I really want to invite you to do blank, but I'm not sure if that's in your comfort zone or not, right? Or hey, how do you want me to handle these kinds of situations? Now that you've shared this with me, how do you want me to handle these kinds of situations? Like, I don't want to exclude you. I don't want to change things, but I also want to really respect your boundaries, right? So I think it's just a matter of communicating that that's the goal, right? That respect and a desire to make situations more comfortable for the other person is your goal, rather than simply retracting as the strategy, or trying to kind of completely ignore as if you never learned anything, right? So again, a really tricky fine balance, but I think it's being vulnerable that you're not sure of the right way to help support the person and soliciting their input is usually the best possible strategy, right? So I don't know how you feel about blank, right? And they might say, oh, well, it doesn't really bother me. Or if it does, I'll tell you, right? Like, you don't need to check in with me. Or thanks for checking in with me. That really means a lot to me. And actually, I don't feel comfortable with blank, right? They'll let you know. But I think it's really important not to just step back or change without the communication with the other person as to why. Okay, so one more don't. I think this is going to wrap up my don'ts, and then we'll move to the do's. The last don't, I already mentioned it, is compare traumas, right? A person's experience is valid even if others have had it quote unquote worse, right? I remember really vividly a case that I treated in the VA where it was a veteran who had been deployed and the air sirens went off, but there were no bombs, there was nothing else, right? But he was really afraid he was going to die. And it just stuck with him that his trauma wasn't as bad compared to all the other people who had seen combat and everything else. And it was just devastating to him that he was so affected by what had happened, but his trauma wasn't as bad, right? It was just so devastating to him. And so I think it's really important that people have a right to their own reactions, no matter what the severity was, right? That their reactions are valid. Okay, I'm going to try to pick up the pace a little bit, I think, here. Yeah, wow. Okay. So a few do's, and then I'll stop. Okay, express love, caring, and esteem, right? Hopefully this seems obvious to everyone. So I'm here for you. I'm so sorry that happened to you. You're not alone. How can I support you, right? Get information from the person about what you can do. Each person, as I mentioned, is different. So how they want to be supported is different. Also, validate, right? This is really, really, really important. So learning about their experience, not the whys, not the why did that happen? So not about the event, how it's affecting them, right? What was that like for you? And don't make assumptions, right? So really try to understand their experience and validate their emotions. Wow, that must have been terrifying. That must have been horrible for you, right? I can understand why you feel so scared. Those kinds of ways of validating emotions, I think, are really, really powerful. And normalizing people's reactions, right? Anyone who went through what you went through would be feeling this way, right? Like it's so natural to feel this way based on what you've experienced. These are all good ways to validate people's emotional responses and reactions, right? And also, if people say, but I froze, right? Again, that's natural. That's a natural response to what was going on. So having these kind of really straightforward ways of normalizing and validating people based on what happened at the time and what's going on now, super, super important. Okay. Build hope, right? So in addition to supporting where they are now, the idea is that things are going to get better with time and they're capable of coping. It's not that they feel great now, but they're capable of coping. They have people who care about them, and there are ways of getting help, right? So there are lots of ways to build hope. It's not the you're going to be fine, right? Because that's a bit dismissive. Rather, you're strong. We're going to get through this. I'm going to be here with you, right? So it is important to build hope without being dismissive, right? Again, you hear that really fine balance between the two. And then finally, make sure you get people to the stuff that works, right? The stuff that's going to be helpful for them. There are professional options, support groups. So tons and tons and tons of online support groups based on the nature of the trauma. Online resources, crisis support services for those who are really currently in a crisis situation. So I really encourage you to help direct people, and especially if you're feeling overwhelmed as the supporter, helping people to get to the right resources and asking them a question like, do you have someone that you feel like you can share this with who's a professional? That's really important, right? So making sure that you get people. Okay, pay attention to, these are my last two. Pay attention to nonverbals when all this is going on, right? So if you're doing this while you're listening, doesn't really look like you're listening no matter what you say. So pay attention to those nonverbals, eye contact, right? How your body, if you're also sitting like this while they're talking, doesn't feel very supportive, no matter if you say, I'm here with you. So not a great idea. And then finally, make sure you're taking care of yourself, right? So supporters can experience burnout, and you can experience distress when supporting others. So good self-care. There are also lots of resources. All the resources I shared for what you can give to others are resources that you can access as a supporter as well, to say like, hey, I have a friend in a crisis. I don't know what to do, right? So those are also available to you as well. Okay. I'm sorry I blazed through the do's, but that at least gives us some time, hopefully, for questions. So I can see all of you. I'm also happy for you to ask questions out loud. Do the do's and don'ts apply to everyone or certain types of people? I think I gave you broad enough principles that they apply to most people, right? Now, again, ways to share your experience in an effective way. So can you do that? Yes. But I think that, again, you want to be really thoughtful about it. I'm happy to make my slides available. And I know this session was also recorded, so certainly happy to circulate those. Okay, how would you go about talking to someone about possible next steps if they wanted to take action without making it sound like they have to? Yeah, that's a good question. say, a lot of folks who experience, it sounds like you went through something super intense. A lot of people who experience really intense things like what you went through find that it's really helpful to talk to someone. And I'm wondering if you've thought about that. Have you thought about, so again, questioning, not saying you should, I'm not shoulding on them, right? You should see someone, but have you ever thought about that? Have you thought about what it would be like to share this with a professional? And if they say, yeah, but I don't even know where to get started, great. Do you want my help? Right? So ask more questions, give people answers, right? And there's a way of, suggesting things by asking questions rather than telling people what they should be doing. Yeah. Great question. Other questions? I'm sorry for running over time. I get excited about this stuff and then I get into it. Yeah, it's a great question. Okay, Edward asks a really important question. So in the don't slide, so I mentioned something like, it's okay, it's not that big of a deal when talking about non-traumatic things like tests, school, or those problematic phrases in general are only for trauma situations. I think that it is okay to try to encourage people to have a different perspective. I think that, there might be a way to do it that, because I think I've probably said things like that too, right? Like, yeah, it's going to be okay, right? Like it's one test, or I'm sure you did great, right? So I think we all reflexively say things like that, especially on kind of stressors rather than traumas. And I do think that's okay. I think it depends on if you sense that somebody's really stressing about it, like deep stressing, a lot of worry, they're spinning on it a lot. That thing might not be helpful to say versus like, hey, what do you think is going to happen if this turns out bad, right? Or really like being there with the person in their emotion is probably going to feel more supportive if they're really feeling in a spiral and really feeling stuck on it. Yeah, great question. Yeah, these are hard things to know too, right? Sometimes you just want somebody, and you know this from your own perspective, like sometimes you just want somebody to tell you like, you're good, you got it, right? And you just need that like little bit of reinforcement. And sometimes, somebody will say something like that to you and you're like, no, but I don't. And that does not feel helpful. So it's hard because it can really depend. Yeah. But I think being with somebody in the moment is really the key thing. Other questions?
It looks like there's two other questions in the chat. One was from Jenny, where she asked, sometimes people share when they have worse traumas, wanting to provide hope as I can get through it. So do you, but when done inappropriately, it's invalidating or dismissive. How should we go about this?
Yeah, that's a really great point, right? So there is that opportunity to share as a way of trying to build hope, right? So those two things kind of conflict a little bit with one another. I think you can do it if the focus is really on building hope, right? So if you say like, I've gone through something too, and I'll tell you, it took time and I felt the way you did and it got better for me. I don't know what your experience is going to be like, but I'm really hopeful that you'll also feel better with time. Or, I went through something really hard and I talked to someone about it and it really helped me. Everybody's different, but I'm wondering if that might be helpful. So I think there's a way of acknowledging. I think in both of those circumstances, you can see I kind of made sure there was room to acknowledge, like, I don't know everything. I'm not saying these two things are exactly the same, right? But I'm wondering if this is helpful for you. And again, I ask it as a question rather than making it as a statement. So I think there is a way to do that, but it has to be done with that kind of delicacy, is what I would recommend. Yeah. What's the other question I missed?
The one with Serena, right before Edward's comment. If you end up expressing your experience to the survivor because they ask if experience the same thing, how do you bridge the conversation back to their experience so you're not ending up focusing on yours?
Yeah. So I think if you do end up sharing your experience, I think, so let's say they say, I've had this trauma happen to me, and I feel so alone. And you say, you don't have to be alone. I've actually experienced something like that. And you share a little bit of something about that. You can say, how are you feeling now about it? Or, what's going through your mind? Or like, is there, I know for me, people being there for me was really important. How can I be there for you? Right. So you shift it back to the other person and ask them what they need. It's always a good idea to ask other people, what can I do for you? Do you want me to help you come up with strategies of how to manage like the sleep or problems you've been having? Or do you want me to just sit with you? Right. Like because different people are going to need different things, and even the same people are going to need different things at different times. So kind of asking them and getting their input can be really helpful. Yeah, all great questions. Any other questions I can answer for y'all?
If there are not, feel free to like keep dropping them in the chat if there are any questions, and Dr. Zalta can for sure like answer them. But if not, we just wanted to say thank you all so much for attending the conference and especially attending this workshop. Thank you, Dr. Zalta, for presenting. This is honestly super helpful and really informative. And just like taking the time to answer all these questions, and it's really helpful. So thank you so much for presenting. Thank you everyone for being here and for attending the conference. I hopefully y'all had seen some of the other presentations, but if not, we are recording all of these presentations and they will be posted up on our website sometime this week, hopefully. And thank you all so much for being here. And I hope that this conference was helpful and this workshop was helpful for everyone that was here. So thank you.
And thank you to all the organizers who care about these issues and topics and questions, and for bringing this content to all of us. So thank you for your time. It's really important. And thank you all for being here to support your loved ones.
Yes.
Thank you all.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.